We are not even able to fall back upon the trusty old tree rings, because we don't know which trees were there at the moment. We have no way of actually clearing this situation. We have only the broad picture of many peoples to whom things happened once upon a time. We do know, however, that this once upon a time was already in vogue and well used, being accepted as ancient lore as early as 7,000 years ago. We know that the ancient peoples of the valley of the Euphrates and of Egypt referred to ancient times in their earliest recorded works. So the historians and the storytellers of the old dynasties were using once upon a time just as we are. And this must imply that the term originates prior to the rise of these historical states as we know them. If then we shall assume some of these things, we must turn back now and try to appraise our Atlantean. What manner of man was this? Who was he? What kind of a person? Is it true that great scientists and philosophers and scholars flourished in this empire of the Golden Gates 25,000 years ago? Did some strange catastrophe wipe out the first spaceships, aeroplanes? Were these people great scientists? Are we merely struggling to regain what they once knew? It's all very dramatic, very interesting, very difficult. Actually, we have to develop our premises very largely from the only record that we have in the Near Eastern area, in the Mediterranean area, and that is Plato. He tells us that they had great laws, good laws. He tells us that they built a great temple to the deity Poseidon, and that in this temple was a magnificent statue of the deity, that these people worked precious metals, that they were able to plate the walls of their city with orichalcum, a mysterious metal of the greatest hardness, like the plates or scales of a suit of armor. These people had armor, spears, bow and arrow, or at least some similar weapon. They were able to make war, and they were sufficiently aggressive so that it was not until the Athenians arose against them that they met any resistance in their migration. They domesticated the horse, which was sacred to the god who was the ruler of their land. They possessed the knowledge of the tilling of the soil, and from the description of their harbors, their earthworks, their ships, their laws, their ancient hierarchical orders, the descent of their rulers, their princely and priestly families, their knowledge of medicine, law, and science, from all these fragments put together, we must have been in the presence of a reasonably advanced type of person. Now, this does not mean, by any circumstance, that we must regard the Atlantean as a miracle or a wonder of wonders. All we need to do is to see him standing in the background of the ancient world, standing against the background of the great dynasties of Babylonia and Egypt, standing perhaps almost like some vast pre-Egyptian in the midst of the city which he had built, the city of great monuments and pyramids, a wonderful city on a wonderful land, fertile, which he was able to cultivate, where he had learned to gather the fruits of the fields and to sow the grain. He had gained much knowledge. It would be almost inconceivable that the gods of the islands would have written tablets, inscribing them with their instructions, and this Plato simply tosses in, had not the people had a written language. Nor would he be likely to refer to these achievements had they no histories or historical records. So we must assume that perhaps, as in the case of Egypt or Greece, that some at least of the Atlanteans were literate, that they possessed a written language and could preserve history, that they could also preserve chronology, and that perhaps they are some almost hypothetical Mayan, a learned person such as those met by Cortez when he arrived in the Western world and beheld for the first time the Venice of America, the city of floating ships and islands, ruled over by the wise and colorful Montezuma. Now, how do we gain any further knowledge of this? We gain it again by going to the myths of these circumference peoples, the mysterious beings who came to them in the dawn of time, responsible for their advancement and their knowledge, are always attributed as possessing such attributes as we have listed. In other words, they were persons wearing armor, apparently a kind of chain or scale armor, which caused them to resemble fishes. That these people also came in boats, that they could navigate, and that when they reached the land, they brought with them in every instance a culture level higher than that of the people to whom they came. The picture is therefore that at least in the area under consideration, this colonizing was into primitive regions, as was the case in the 18th and 19th century in many cases, and that these various merchants or maritime adventurers actually developed primitive peoples and secured from them valuable commodities. In exchange, they left the inevitable record of their presence. Perhaps they sent missionaries. Perhaps they established permanent colonies. These things we cannot know with certainty. Now, if this was occurring 10, 12, 14,000 years ago, 20,000 perhaps, what was the state of the rest of the world? What was the state of the rest of the world when Great Britain produced its colonial empire? It was not a world of Great Britain and savagery. It was a world of several great cultures, and a world in which, by its own peculiar nature and skill, Great Britain was able to create this vast mercantile commonwealth. Now, it is not at all necessary that at the time of the Atlanteans no other civilized people existed. There is much to indicate that great migrations moving from northern Asia were also to be considered as important. For the beginning of the great Arya migration, which was to finally take the place of the Atlantean world and to dominate the culture which we now know, was certainly underway, moving into the theater of world affairs, down through the valley of the Sind and the great Indo-Gangetic plain of India. It is quite probable, likewise, that the migrations of this Atlantean area might have carefully avoided large and powerful nations that also had existence. It may never have reached them, having been limited largely to the great Atlantic area, or it may have reached them and fraternized with them. We have no record that it warred with them. Plato would imply from his account that there was no such thing as war as we know it until it was developed by the Atlanteans. that they were the first mortals to engage in war. If such is the case, perhaps they were the first whose ambitions, perhaps towards world dominion, brought them into conflict with the ambitions of others, or brought down upon them the resentments of exploited groups or pillaged culture systems. However we may wish to view this, Plato then moves into a moral ethical consideration in which he points out that the destruction of Atlantis was due to the disobedience of the princes and their peoples, who departed from the laws which had been given to them by their divine Father, the God of the seas. And as retribution for these errors, terrible catastrophes descended upon them, and they were destroyed. Plato's account ends at this point. No one knows why. It is possible that Solon's account also so ends, or that Plato, concerned with other essays, neglected this one, or perhaps purposely he intended it to go no further. In any event, we have the powerful concept of such a cultural center. This causes us then to begin to patch together the framework and remnants of the old cultures of the world in an effort to discover, if we can, such common material as could well have been derived from a single source. We have considerable such material available to us. For example, one of the earliest accounts relating to this arriving out of the sea of the stranger on his ship or upon his raft of serpents is that related to Dagon, the Babylonian Chaldean culture hero. Dagon, or Oannes, the man who came out of the sea with the body of a human, with the head of a human being and the body of a fish, might well represent our mysterious Atlantean merchant or navigator. That he came out of the sea means merely that he came over the horizon. That he was riding upon a dragon means only that he came upon a ship. The messengers of Montezuma thought that Cortez had arrived on a dragon and declared they had seen it from the shore. So we can pretty well consider what this means. Perhaps dragon carving on the bow of a boat. Perhaps merely the sail or the oars, resembling many legs, led a very primitive people to believe that a sea monster had risen before them. In any event, what was the first thing that this seaman taught to the people in the valley of the Euphrates? The first thing that he is said to have given them was good government. Good government meaning social organization. He taught them the importance of cooperation, of the building of tribal or national consciousness, of giving them community life, of having them settle to become the dwellers in towns and villages, to end their ancient wanderings. He also taught them to cook their food, which previously they had eaten raw. He taught them that it was not necessary merely to fish for their food with a bone hook. He taught them how to snare and capture animals. He taught them how to weave cloth. These are things that are particularly related to these cultured deities. To till the soil, to gather medicinal herbs, to treat various kinds of sickness, to organize a calendar for the historical and chronological preservation of their dates, and also a written language in which they could preserve records. Furthermore, he taught them to build by laws of architecture, and in several cases he is accredited with having given them music. He is certainly associated with basic arts and sciences and crafts. And before the completion of his mysterious sojourn with them, he had given them the momentum, the impetus to achieve to a new level of social greatness. Now, in several instances, we observe thinly veiled what may be the realistic answer to the problem. Namely, that this same man taught them to gather various plants, taught them to mine the earth, taught them to catch birds for beautiful plumage, and also to raise special fruits and harvests, leading to their prosperity. This implies that this visitor was setting up a proper situation for an exchange of goods. In other words, he was helping these people to develop skills, presumably with the idea that after they had produced this goods, he would take it and merchandise it for them. Furthermore, there is evidence that this stranger left artifacts behind him. He left things that had belonged to his people. These became sacred relics, regarded with the most profound veneration. Now, as we begin to analyze this stranger who came from the sea, we almost inevitably come to the conclusion that he could not have been one but many. And this is again sustained by the records. For the records in Chaldea alone seem to point to at least 5 persons concealed under the identity of Dagon, or Oannes, the fishman. These persons visited the area at widely different periods, but had similar missions and identical contributions to make. And gradually, in prehistory, these personalities were either considered as one person with a phenomenal length of life, or as re-embodiments or returns of this one person on a religious level as avatars or re-embodiments. So we look this over with a rather critical thought in mind. We seem to observe a great deal of solid common sense. We have someone coming at that time to a people, establishing perhaps, as in the case in Mexico, where it is said Quetzalcoatl brought with him a retinue of persons of his own kind, and established a kind of court or community. In some instances, the emphasis is upon religious matters, but always it is upon advancement. And in every instance, the same second act takes place. The strangers departed in due course, usually having appointed a successor or someone from among the people to carry on the program that had been started. In each case, the strangers promised to return, and in no case did they return. This is, I think, also important. Always the strangers said he would come back. Always he warned the people to keep the rules and laws, because he would come back and find out whether they had or not. Also, this stranger emphasized the need for honesty and for integrity and for dedication. And he warned the people not to abuse the knowledge which he had given them, stating that if they did abuse this knowledge, they would destroy themselves. So with fond-a-do's of one kind or another, this mythological ancestor, this psychological forebear, vanished back into the sea again. He always went out for the same mysterious road of water by which he had come. His ship or his dragon seemed to vanish under the ocean, and he was never seen again. And his people waited for him, and they kept his rules, sometimes for centuries and thousands of years. And many, even in the world today, whether we realize it or not, are still keeping those ancient rules and still waiting for the return of the hero who came out of the sea. Where you find this maybe in 40 or 50 scattered culture groups, it has to have a meaning. There has to be something under it. We can say psychologically that perhaps it originates within man. This can be advanced and sustained with some logic. But it does not explain the lack of certain growth factors. These primitive people say and demonstrate by their later action, yesterday we were savages. Then this man came, and immediately we were no longer savages. Within 50 years, within 20 years, within 100 years at most, these primitive peoples began to record their history. They changed their grass huts into great buildings. Sciences, arts, and crafts burst into bloom. Here they are. Yesterday they were not. And they tell us that the reason why this change was so rapid was because this knowledge was given to them. It was not evolved the slow and difficult way requiring thousands of years of gradual cultivation. This was given to them as a kind of birthright, a heritage. And they took it upon themselves and in a very short time gained astonishing proficiency. Consider the modern situation. As a result of the entrance of higher culture groups into primitive areas, many backward areas of our earth have been completely transformed in 150 years. We know this is happening. And we know that within the next 50 years, many new states and nations that 200 years ago were savages will sit as civilized human beings at the tables of our conferences. Thus rapidly does this contact bring with it the change in the state of things. This may also explain why, under the tremendous impulse of this almost divine mystery, for with ancient peoples everything that cannot be understood is sacred, under the impulse of this hero and the legends rising around him, small groups of persons became the custodians of the deeper phases of his laws. The knowledge that he could not or would not wish to have forgotten was communicated to the old ones, the priests. They apparently were among his earliest converts, the local native wise men. He formed them into schools, into a kind of group of elders, perhaps his form of a privy council or of a legislative body to surround him and protect him and advance his projects. When he was gone, these legislators he had trained became the keepers of his wisdom. They are the ones that then proceeded to initiate young people into this body as time went on so that the secrets could not be lost. In some cases, the secrets were lost. Some cultures became totally extinct, and we have no remnant or record of them as surviving. In the stronger and more healthy groups, however, there was survival. And this survival means that in a reasonably short length of time, these peoples emerged almost simultaneously or very closely allied in time sequences. And that suddenly the curtain of history rolls up and we see history. And we see it coming into our understanding. But behind this history is nothing but secrets. Ancient institutions dedicated to the gods, to the sciences, to the arts, and to the religions. Each of these gods part of a strange order of beings. Now let us remind ourselves of one other thing, that even in the times of Plato and Thales and the other great Greek thinkers, there was a hypothesis strongly held that the gods had originally been mortals. Also, among the Egyptians, Plutarch tells us that the great gods of Egypt were antediluvian kings who had been deified after death. Now this has more or less disappeared from our thinking, but perhaps it also has a bearing upon this present consideration. We do not mean to imply that all religion rises merely from prehistoric history. We do mean to imply, however, that between man as a worshipping being, worshipping the great creative principles of life, and man in his present complicated theological structure, there is an interval of interpretation, of impersonation, of personification, by means of which hierarchies or pantheons of divinities have arisen in nearly all parts of the world. These divinities, in most instances, like the Olympian gods, the Aces of Scandinavia, or the great Egyptian gods of Philae and Luxor, these deities have their stories. They have their histories. They have legends about them. They have their persecutions and their problems, their fortunes and their misfortunes. They were sometimes victorious and sometimes defeated, and they were subject to most of the moods that mortals can understand. The Egyptians and Greeks believed that these secondary orders of deities might very well have been originally human beings, living at a remote time and with unique achievements, by means of which they became the patrons and were recognized as divine by lesser peoples to whom they brought culture and enlightenment. This would again fit into our hypothesis. If, for example, there was a cultured people, a highly civilized people, that took some kind of a paternal interest in the then wandering nomadic tribes that are now the nations of the world, if such cultivated persons existed, we have no record of them whatever except in that mysterious account of the time when the gods walked the earth prior to the rise of the ordinary human way of life. Every people has this account. The account that once upon a time the gods were among them, taught them, worked with them, gave them their privileges, established their priesthood, set up their monarchies, so that ancient peoples all believed themselves to have been descendants of deities, and even the Emperor of Japan believes that his dynasty goes back to the goddess Amaterasu Omikami, the goddess of the sun, a divine being from whom a human dynasty proceeded. Everywhere it is the same. Ancient rulers governed by the divine right of kings, and this divine right was by descent from the heavenly kings that preceded the human rulers. This thinking could take considerable interpretation, for it could well be that behind the history, this dim band that we cannot penetrate, is the band of these ancient gods. Now let us appropriate a scientific, philosophical, psychological thought. Supposing we assume that 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, Primitive men, having attained, however, a measure of culture, began to contemplate their own origin. Suppose, for example, that the Eskimo or some of the Totem Indians had a long history and were going back to try to develop a concept of where they came from and who these great gods were, from whom they were descended. If they could go back to the earliest forms of their legends, there's one important thing that we must bear in mind. It is very difficult for any people or even an individual to imagine clearly a state superior to himself unless he is in the presence of example. It is quite possible for a primitive man of today, having seen a civilized man, to imagine him. But if the primitive man had never seen a civilized man and knew of no other kind of creature than himself, it is very doubtful if he could have imagined a group of ancestors or predecessors sublimely superior to himself. He would not have known how to describe them or what to call them. He could not imagine the origin of his clan being any different from the world that he knew. Yet our primitive forebears, arising from a primitive state, all had a clear concept of the existence in the world prior to their time of a culture system supremely advanced beyond their own. Thus the Greeks, at their very dawn, contemplating upon the gods of the great Hyperborean range, or the gods who abode north of the winds, saw Olympus as a magnificent assembly not only of rather human gods, but also of great attainments, of great skill, and of supreme authority, wisdom, and power. The gods of Greece and Egypt were great gods, looking down upon their world. And those who first envisioned them and gave us the ancient legends about them give us legends of a highly sophisticated nature, totally inconsistent with the people among whom these legends arose. Thus we may question not only the spontaneous development of a people in an unreasonably short time by their own efforts, or that these peoples, while still comparatively primitive, would attribute their growth by imagination alone to a specifically cultured group superior to themselves. These things do not normally occur in human psychology. And if probably anything, our ancestor was more normal than we are, because he did not have the confused and complicated social structures that make life difficult for us. So here we are with a new group of elements to consider. Let us take one of these elements and trace it briefly. Where did our religious insight arise? When Quetzalcoatl reached the shores of the Western Hemisphere, the man who came on the raft of serpents, he brought with him the worship of one God. When the ancient Oannes came to the shores of Babylonia, he brought the worship of one God. When Fu He, the great primitive ancestor of China, the man born out of the body of a fish, who rose from the sea and gave to the Chinese the mystery of the trigrams and the great writing, when he came to them, he brought to them the worship of one God, Shanti, imperial heaven. When Vishnu, in India, in the embodiment of the first avatar, born out of the body of a fish, and so created to rescue the law which had been carried to the bottom of the ocean by a demon. When this being came forth to become the inspiration of the great Puranic literature of India, he taught the worship of one God. When Virakaka came to Peru, he taught the existence of one God. And wherever we go, it is the same. These primitive peoples apparently had worshipped idols, or had worshipped fetishes, or had merely the primitive juju magic of the Vuitton and the African primitive. But immediately these leaders appeared. They brought the message of the one true Father. They taught that this Father was invisible. They taught that this Father was not embodied, but that this Spirit dwelt everywhere, in everything, and the Incas of Peru worshipped it by kissing the wind. They also believed in the importance of light as the symbol of the invisible power. And the Peruvians had a concept of the sun almost identical with that of Akhenaten in Egypt nearly 2,000 years earlier. Thus, this power that came, this teacher, brought basic religious ideas. These ideas spread wherever this teaching spread. But the spreading was confined to levels. And as Plutarch also tells us, the candidate for initiation into the mysteries was ultimately initiated into the mystery of the one true God, not known to the people, but having been given to the mysteries by their divine founders long before. Is it any more difficult to assume that these divine founders represented an ancient culture level than it is to believe that these divine founders are to be understood as actual deities who took upon themselves bodies at their pleasures, wandered about the earth like Votan, and instructed a few whom they pleased? Is one hypothesis more difficult than the other? It seems to me that it is much more natural to assume that a man learns from his father, and that this father is his progenitor, his instructor, than it is that he learns from some invisible power that visits him remotely or occasionally according to some strange and unpredictable whim. So it would appear very reasonable. Now, if these teachers from far places had brought only abstract ideas, we could say inspiration, instinct, intuition would be applicable. But when among a widely diversified group, specific technical knowledge is communicated simultaneously over large areas, we must begin to question the pure intuitive hypothesis. It seems far more reasonable to assume that these teachings were derived from some previous and adequate source that had the means to disseminate such instruction. Now, if we assume also that these teachers at a remote time returned to their own lands, or that the great mercantile centers which they represented were destroyed, then we have several possibilities. If, for example, during the height of the British colonial theory, the British islands themselves had sunk, it would not have meant the complete dissolution of all these different colonial projects. It would have meant, rather, that these projects would have been thrown upon their own resources, and in varying degrees of preparedness would have had autonomy thrust upon them. It would also mean that such travelers, merchants, scholars, missionaries, humanitarians, as survived because perhaps they were either on the sea or in these distant regions at the time of the catastrophe, would be required to establish new domicile, and probably would remain with the groups where they had created areas of prestige. Thus we may have a phenomenon which is noted among ancient peoples, and that is the curious differences between what might be termed certain aristocratic families within a racial group and the structure of that group itself. Sir Marco Polo, who visited Angkor, the great Khmer center in Indochina, the ruins of which are another unsolved riddle, declared that it was perfectly possible to tell the members of the aristocratic and royal family because of the complete difference in the color of their skin and in the structure of their features. Although these people had been born there and had ruled there for centuries, they were not the same stock. Now, the legends in that area are also rather explicit, and the concept seems to suggest that in all possibility the Atlantean group may have lain at the root of dynasties in areas under their control or domination. That this group intermarried or perhaps selected certain racial stock for the extension of its own sphere of influence, and that there may therefore be definite traces of Atlantean bloodstream in non-Atlantean peoples who were reached at that time, and whose achievements centered around certain heroic groups within their own structure, as, for example, the caste system in India. We have every reason to believe that this caste system was set up deliberately to prevent the mingling of the bloodstream of the Aryas from the north, who were coming down into India, and the ancient primitive stock of the Dravidians. To preserve the dynamic of the new bloodstream, the caste system was instituted. There are small caste systems on practically every island of the Polynesians. There are small caste systems in every tribe in Africa. These caste systems seem to speak of the descent of certain families that had custodial rights at ancient times. And the proof that there was a setting aside is in the structural difference in these classes, a difference which cannot be accounted for by any difference of opportunity or environment, or any known difference of racial background. Thus we have the possibility, which has been long affirmed, that the religions of man came from these semi-divine beings, that these religions are all aspects of one faith, that this one faith, or the Vedas, the law, that this faith had its root in some central religious core, and may very well have been the religious code of Atlantis. It is very close to the pronouncements given by Plato concerning the nature of this code for the government of the Atlantic islands. Also, although Atlantis was an empire kingdom, the laws were such that they consoled Plato tremendously in the development of his concept of democracy. The liberties, privileges, and rights of the Atlantean peoples indicated a high degree of socialized attainment. This attainment could well be the impetus which caused other peoples, receiving it for the first time, to feel that it led them out of bondage and brought them a new vision of the dignity of man. This whole problem, then, would rest upon what would happen if this hub area, as Plato has described, was destroyed in 24 hours, carrying with it to death nearly 60 million human beings. If such a catastrophe occurred, it would mean one of 3 or 4 circumstances. First, the breaking down, the collapse of this colonial relationship, insofar as those more remote areas which were seldom reached and only occasionally contacted were concerned. Such areas would have only a dim legend at best of some strange person that came to them, changed their way of life, and never returned. The second group, where more permanent voyaging had set up some type of semi-permanent structure, would have the more clearly defined social impulse to go on, to build empire. A third group, in which perhaps would be involved some of these Atlantean survivors themselves, who thereby took on and took over the rapid progress of certain social and racial groups, might have resulted in the rise of the mythological kingdoms of the remote past, these brilliant and wonderful states that came out of nothing and flourished and gained so vast a reputation that men believed that they belonged to the gods. These Atlanteans who stayed could well have been gods walking among men, living with them, as Quetzalcoatl is said to have lived for many years, and finally either dying or departing. One interesting point in connection with this story is that although these gods did come and perform these services and were apparently divine beings, most of them are reported to have died. 2 things. Either they went back to the sea, or else they remained and died. There are a number of accounts that they did remain and die, as for example the mound for the god Odin, or Wotan, which is still to be seen, the grave near Uppsala in Scandinavia. An ancient monumental mound said to be the graves of the gods. That these gods died of various causes is also suggested. And in some instances, the legends are so confused that it seems as though later generations, trying to preserve the heroic nature of these deities, did not wish to let it appear that they had died. Yet Osiris died at the hand of his brother Typhon. The ancient gods and godlings, though greatly revered, were in a strange way mortal. And out of this mortality came this descent, this benediction by which a new generation of rulers came into existence. And among some tribes these were supposed to be the continuous re-embodiments of the same ruler, as in the case of the Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas of Tibet. Thus, many things fitting together fit into Plato's narrative. The problem of disobedience, which caused the destruction of Atlantis, might also very well play into our situation, because these peoples are regarded as the originators of war. And war certainly was among the earliest indoctrinations of mankind. That primitive warfare probably existed in the most primitive society, we do not doubt. But the great political development of warfare also emerges in the dawn of modern time, in the dawn of our historical period. Yet there are scattered about the earth's ancient battlefields in which highly trained troops went into war thousands of years ago, thousands of years before the conquests of Alexander and Caesar, and perhaps long before the siege of Troy. The machines of war, the instruments, and the political and military theories of war also come down to us from a long, long ago. All of the nations had these things, had them as they had the better gifts and wiser givings. And by degrees we see this emergence. We see a great period of glory at the root, at the beginning, a tremendous virility, a tremendous vitality of consciousness, the magnificence of Babylon, the transcendent beauty of the great classical civilization of Egypt, the wonderful glory that was Greece, the ancient grandeur that was Rome. We see the ruins of these great achievements, and we perceive also that by degrees these ancient cultures have vanished, and that in their place, in many instances, the peoples involved continually declined, so that gradually the makers of these great cultures vanished entirely. There are no longer any ancient Egyptians. The modern Egyptian is an Arab. His dynasty of old is gone, and history closed him off almost 2,000 years ago. Yet he had a great time and fell into darkness. Why were so many of these great institutions so blackened, so darkened? And why were still earlier ones, of which only myth remains, also always falling away into darkness? It seems that the great vitality of these cultures was imparted from some level of knowledge, from some measure of understanding, more dramatic and dynamic than has ever since come to the world. That these early impacts lifted men dramatically to a great achievement, and then came the story of life as we know it, the story which is nothing more than man drifting away from the truths he has learned, compromising, selling out his principles, leaving the ancient footings of ethics and ideals, transgressing the laws of the great beings who came to him in the dawn. They warned him that this would be their own destruction, but the people would not listen. They continued to fall away, so that our history is largely a falling away from the great spiritual foundations and a drifting into material accomplishments, a drifting perhaps which Plato could cover under his concept of another Atlantis, in which man is submerged by the sea of his own thoughts and is drowned in the processes of his own mind. In any event, this, I think, is the Greco-Egyptian core of our subject, the farther core from which so much else has to come, and upon which we must build our next consideration, which will be to begin the analysis and examination of the various records in various areas dealing with this subject and the effort we shall make to evaluate them. And we thank you for being with us.